transition movement began in 2006, motivated by the twin challenges of peak oil and climate change. Over subsequent years, peak oil has faded as a major driver while climate change has grown and grown, and the movement has broadened its scope to reimagine how communities can be more sustainable and socially just. The world is now a very different place from 14 years ago, with the Black Lives Matter movement teaching us more about exclusion and systemic racism, the rise of eco-anxiety, the more confrontational activism of groups like Extinction Rebellion, the rise of extreme right-wing politics, and so much more. So tonight we're asking, what are the challenges the world demands of us in 2020? And in our planning for what transition needs to look like, how does it need to organize over the next 10 years? Later in this webinar, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions, but to help us explore this evening's question, we're joined by three fabulous guests. Kevin Anderson holds the joint chair between the School of Engineering at the University of Manchester, the Centre for Environment and Development Studies at Uppsala University in Sweden, and Centre for Climate and Energy Transformation at the University of Bergen in Norway. He recently completed 2 years as the Zenstrom Professor of Climate Change Leadership at Uppsala and previously held the role of Director of the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research. He is research active with publications in science, nature, geosciences, and climate policy. He engages widely across all tiers of government, UK, EU, Sweden, on issues ranging from shale gas, aviation and shipping, to the role of climate modelling, carbon budgets and negative emissions technologies. With Uppsala colleagues, Kevin has made a key contribution to the development of Paris-compliant carbon budgets for Swedish län and kommuner, and with Manchester colleagues, his analysis has contributed to the framing of the UK's Climate Change Act and the development of national carbon budgets. He has a decade's industrial experience, principally in the petrochemical industry. He's a chartered engineer and a fellow of the Institution of Mechanical Engineers. Nick Anim joined Transition Town Brixton in 2012. In 2014, he started his research into the processes and outcomes of transition towns, with Transition Town Brixton as his case study. He's been tangentially involved with other environmental movements, such as Extinction Rebellion as well, in order to try and better understand the perennial challenges of inclusion and diversity in environmental activism. In that regard, he has always placed social justice, and more specifically racial justice, on the table in all discussions about transition initiatives in the multicultural setting of Brixton, South London. He's very much driven by questions of how to build solidarity across differences. Earlier this year, he received an award at UCL for his research. And Eva Schonveld is a climate activist, process designer and facilitator, supporting new forms of organizing such as sociocracy, decision-making and facilitation in a range of contexts, including XR Scotland. After many years working in the arts, she went on to co-found Scotland's first transition town and city network to inspire the transition movement across Scotland, and was commissioned by the Scottish Government to establish and manage Transition Scotland Support. She recently has co-founded Starter Culture, which is developing a range of projects to tackle the marginalization of the inner dimension at different levels in scale, including working on supporting more relational ways of doing politics in Scotland. She's also a co-founder of Heart Politics, which exists to address the interconnected social and environmental threats that arise from dividing humans from the wider ecology and from dividing our minds from our hearts, which is currently working on a fractal grassroots to global process which aims to connect open-hearted listening and creative redesign processes with a global citizens' assembly. What a phenomenal group of people we have here with us this evening. And I want to start by inviting each of our guests to speak for around 10 minutes to give their reflections on the scale, the nature, and the challenge of the next 10 years, to offer some provocations and also some suggestions or ideas. If you're new to Zoom, you can click on the speaker view in the top right-hand corner, which will mean the speaker will take up your full screen in all their glory. So you might like to do that. So I'm going to first of all ask Kevin. Kevin, you have 10 minutes. You are most welcome. Thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rob. Hopefully you can hear me now. I'm just putting up my slides. Hopefully you can see my slides. Can you see them, Rob?
Not yet.
Oh, no. That's a bit odd. It says share screen, so let me just try it once more. It's the wonders of technology. Let's try this.
Yeah, there we are. You're on now. Perfect.
Good. Right, okay. Let me just minimize that. Okay, well, thanks very much. I was trying to think where I fitted into this idea of a 4-course meal. And I don't think what I'm going to contribute tonight will be anything even, not even an appetizer. It's almost the opposite, really. It's something that's quite unpalatable, I think. But I think if we don't start from there, then we don't know what the 4-course meal needs to look like, if you like. So, so I apologise in advance that this is not a very uplifting talk. So I've called it here from laggard to leader, and I can get this thing to work anyway. And what I want to do is take us from Paris and the framing of the Paris Agreement, and then just sketch out towards the end what that might mean for the transition network. My focus will be solely on the energy system, and I want to on reducing emissions from the energy system. And I want to point out that the agricultural emissions are hugely important. About 20% of the warming relates to agricultural emissions. It's not my area of expertise. We can reduce emissions from agriculture and from land use, but we cannot eliminate them. But when it comes to energy, we can eliminate all carbon dioxide emissions and greenhouse gas emissions from the energy system. So that's my focus for this presentation, but it's not to undermine the value of agriculture. I take the Paris Agreement at face value. The talk is based on science and equity, and I ignore political and economic sensibilities as I do in all my research. That's not to say that politics and economics aren't important. Of course they are, but the sort of short-term sensibilities, I'm disinterested in those in relation to my research and my conclusions. And I would argue if you actually take this sort of framing, of a direct literal framing, then I think you get a challenge in terms of reducing our emissions, which is very different from those that we typically hear about, whether it's the net zero report or indeed much of the work that comes out of what I view to be the very co-opted realm of academia. For some reason the slides, oh, that's better. So what does the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, tell us about the Paris Agreement? Well, I'm going to take the whole of the IPCC process, which is a huge suite of reports that come out every few years, and summarize it, at least in terms of energy, in one line. It's carbon budgets that matter, not long-term targets. What we do in 2030 or 2050 are all interesting things to avoid action today, but they have nothing to do with the science. If we want to think about temperature, then we have to think about the total amount of carbon dioxide we emit, which has implications for what we do today. And that's why that approach is unpopular generally. So if you think of it just graphically here, going through it quite quickly, it's the area under the curve that matters, the carbon budget, not the end point in 2050, but the area under the curve. And if we choose to delay action in the near term by expanding an airport or developing more oil and gas fields, as we're doing in the North Sea now, then it means that our children will have to compensate for that later on. And I would argue that actually that it will not be possible for them to do that because to reduce the emissions any faster than we have to anyway will not be achievable. And I'll come back to that in a little bit more detail later. So don't worry about all the numbers here. This is just a backdrop. If we take the IPCC's latest report and summarize that in terms of what we need to do to Paris, for Paris, in terms of aiming for 1.5 degrees centigrade and certainly staying well below 2 degrees centigrade, and recognizing that these temperatures on a cold day in the Peak District don't sound too problematic, but at the global level, this is a huge shift in temperature occurring almost overnight. That we know how much carbon we can emit and put into the atmosphere, the carbon budget, and it's about 660 billion tons of carbon dioxide, which probably means very little to many of you. But we put out globally about 37 billion tons in 2018. So that's about 18 years of current emissions at a global level. Okay, emissions have dropped a little bit this year because of COVID, but hardly any. So about 18 years of current emissions, and we'll have blown any reasonable chance of 2 degrees centigrade and completely run through 1.5. Now, before we start to think what we need to do, what you need to do and think about in the transition movement in relation to climate change, we have to be honest about where we are today in 2020. And for people of my generation, that's quite difficult. The first IPCC report came out in 1990, so 30 years ago. And in the intervening 30 years, what have we seen? We've seen emissions go up significantly. At global level, they're up 60% from what they were in 1990 every single year. So we're 60% higher emissions this year than they were in 1990. So we have fundamentally failed, and we continue to fail. Emissions are still rising. This year being an exception because of COVID, but certainly last year emissions went up by a little under 1%. So we've heard lots of rhetoric on climate change, lots of optimistic talks and people turning up at big international events and all of the other things, and lots of applause by the great and the good in the climate world. But actually what we've presided over is 30 years of abject failure in reducing our emissions. And the argument that's often made is, isn't somewhere like the UK, or indeed when I work in Sweden and Norway, aren't these countries showing some leadership? But look at the UK. We've had the net zero report. Hopefully most of you are at least familiar with that report and the sort of headline of it. I prefer to think of it as a not zero report because it's nothing to do with zero carbon. And in that report, they point out that the UK emissions today are 42 to 44% lower than they were in 1990. But that's a very convenient reading of the maths. If you include aviation and shipping emissions, which those numbers deliberately exclude, if you include our imports and exports from particularly some of the poorer parts of the world that now manufacture the goods for us, and then we blame them for the emissions, you include all of those, and what we see in one of the wealthiest countries in the world with 30 years of rhetoric on climate change is virtually no change in our emissions since 1990. Norway's up by about 25%, Sweden's roughly the same as well, no change since 1990. That's true of Denmark, Sweden, France, and in fact the EU more generally has not succeeded in reducing emissions. So without passing this buck onto our children, if we're thinking about what we need to do today, rather than expecting our children to develop technologies in years to come to suck the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which is what we're reliant on in most government policies now, we need to understand the science and the maths of climate change. But we haven't got time for that now, so we're going to bypass through all of that, and instead, in true northern fashion, we're going to think about pies. When I say think about pies, think about the carbon budget as a pie. We have a pie that we've got to split amongst everyone in the world. We know how big that pie is, there or thereabouts, 600 to 700 billion tons of CO2. And we've got to say, split that amongst all countries, and they'll get their share that they have to live within forever, effectively, certainly for the next 100 to 200 years. And what we can do here is take out part of that pie for the wealthier parts of the world, the developed country parties, as they're called in the Paris Agreement. And the rest of the pie then is the majority of the population who live in the poorer parts of the world. So we take out that part of the pie, and we can argue it's a bit bigger or a bit smaller, but we've done some work in detail on this in our latest paper. And then we can ask, of that bit of the pie, how much should the UK get to make its fair contribution to delivering on the Paris Agreement? And in our latest paper, which only came out a few weeks ago, maybe a month and a half ago now, in fact, there's a blog in the Ecologist based on the paper. So it's a much sort of easier version to read rather than plowing through all of the usual academic text that we've got here. So, based on the concept of equity that's embedded in the Paris Agreement and the IPCC carbon budgets, what we can say about the UK is that we have somewhere between 2.8 and 3.7 billion tons, there or thereabouts, from today out across this century. That's the total amount of emissions we can put in the atmosphere. Again, to most of you, that means nothing, but the next bit will help. That means we've got about 9 years of current emissions. At current rates of emissions in the UK, before 2030, we'll have blown through our fair contribution to 2 degrees centigrade. Now, this includes aviation and shipping, but it actually doesn't include our imports and exports, which make things even more challenging. So let's think about that in terms of reducing our emissions. How much does that mean we have to reduce our emissions every single year? And let's compare this analysis, which is based on equity and based on the Paris Agreement and the carbon budgets in the IPCC, but it doesn't assume that our children will suck our carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere in the future using these negative emission technologies, which people postulate and will solve the problem in the future, which the CCC, the Committee on Climate Change, are highly reliant. So just to give a flavour for this, the official government position behind net zero is that we can emit 9 billion tonnes. Our analysis says it's somewhere around about 3 billion tonnes. The reduction rate for the Committee on Climate Change and the government are pursuing is about 5% reduction in every single year. Ours is between 10 and 20%. If everyone failed as badly as the government is planning in the UK, that would be warming of 2.5 to 3 degrees centigrade, which would be disastrous for ecosystems around the planet. I mean, ours is aimed at roughly the 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade, which in itself will be very problematic to many people. Lots of poor, vulnerable communities will suffer at those sorts of temperatures. In fact, they're already suffering at those sorts of temperatures. So against that fairly depressing backdrop of complete inaction, rhetoric, and sometimes just barefaced lies for 30 years, what climate questions should we now be asking within the transition network, and how can that help change the direction in a more progressive fashion? Well, if our preference is to ignore international equity, pass on a huge burden to our children, be part of a 2.5 to 3 degree C future, and renege on our Paris commitments, that's what we're doing at the moment. I mean, that dovetails nicely with today's politics. You haven't got to question the current economic system. It's all part of business as usual, slight adjustments to it. And you don't have to worry about the inequity in our own country in terms of who emits most of the emissions. Then choose the government's 5% mitigation rate and net zero by 2050. Alternatively, if the transition movement thinks we should take international equity seriously, that we actually should make the effort to reduce our emissions in this generation, that we should cut carbon dioxide in line with 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade, and we should try to meet our Paris commitments. That then recognises we need strong political leadership, and that is at every level. That's not top down. That's as much bottom up from the household upwards as it is from the Prime Minister downwards. We need to reshape the current framing of economics, or finance, as I prefer to think of it as it is today. We need national equity at its core, because most emissions come from a relatively small percentage of the population, even in their own country. And this requires deep and rapid shifts in how we live our lives and how we operate our technologies and our institutions across all sectors. Then choose 10 to 20% reduction rates every single year and real zero emissions by about 2035. To conclude, we need new narratives. This is absolutely key. It's not just about the numbers. We have to think about now, well, what constitutes growth, progress, and development? We need to think about reframing values and how we reward success. At the moment, we always reward success by more money, more purchasing resources, and higher carbon emissions. Is that appropriate if we have to reward success at all? We need alternative relationships with time, because we have not really embedded time properly in our thinking about climate change. We need to genuinely embed intra and intergenerational equity. We pay lip service to both of these whilst blindly carrying on with business as usual and a relatively hedonistic lifestyle by those of us who are the high emitters. And we need a much deeper appreciation of the more than human world, of which of course we are part. And if we try to abstract ourselves from it, I think we only exacerbate the tensions and the problems we've already seen. In 2020, climate change has become system change. As Einstein noted, or at least it was attributed to him, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And thus far, we have chosen to pass on to our children the consequences of 30 years of such insanity. I think the last year and a half with the youth movement, Extinction Rebellion, and now obviously with youth rethinking here in terms of the transition movement, I think there are some thin threads of hope actually, and those threads of hope have not come top down. They have not come from the academic community or the great and good in the climate community. They have actually come from almost like grassroots civil society that have started to put pressure on the rest of us to have greater integrity and greater honesty. So I think there are some thin threads of hope. I think the transition movement is one of those, but without those, we are going to fail. So on that note of handing the responsibility over to you, as well as the rest of us, of course, thank you very much for listening.
Brilliant, Kevin. Thank you so much. Glorious as ever, and so much to think about. Brilliant, thank you. So I'm going to hand over to Nick Anim now for our second contribution this evening. Nick.
Wow, thank you so much, Kevin. That was wonderful. Now to take it from Kevin's almost technical lens, I'm going to go a bit more personal, shall we say. Inaugural webinar in the series, and I hope everyone's signed up to join the next few webinars in the next few days. Very honored to be on the panel with two such important colleagues and guests and friends in the fight against climate change. I mean, Kevin, whose work in Manchester and Uppsala is widely recognized and who has not been shy in bringing truth to bear on our politicians' rhetoric in regard to addressing the climate emergency we face. And Eva, whose work on community arts projects in Scotland brings an important focus to the critical inner dimensions of our daily struggles within movements and also elsewhere. And of course, I must acknowledge you, Rob, for your hard work and prophetic legacy in starting and shaping the transition ideology some 15 years ago. Yes, the transition movement is a leaderless movement, but you have in so many ways and at various times provided the ideological and discursive compass that continues to help guide various transition initiatives, not just in this country, but also around the world. Now, of course, we're here today because no movement can survive unless it is constantly growing and changing with the time. And in that respect, the clue is in the name transition. Transition Town movement is always a movement that is critically reflexive and always looking to change, do things better, and so on. If a movement isn't growing, if it's stagnant and without the support of people, then it can't exist. And we are lucky to have a lot of people in local communities supporting the work that we do. So my brief talk today on my longitudinal research into why environmental movements tend to be green but mostly white is about how movements tend to be green but mostly white. Now the very nature of that framing suggests that I am likely to say things, or I hope at least that I say some things that unsettle you a bit as listeners, as our colleagues from transitioners. Transition towns, and also unnerve you a bit, provoke you into taking some actions locally. I set out to explore the perennial challenges of inclusion and diversity in local environmental movements. And by local, I mean social movements that are specifically place-based, for whom the local represents a distinct place with its own history, culture, politics, and economics. Increasingly in the space-time compression of our interconnected and interdependent world, local movements such as the Transition Towns movement, Extinction Rebellion, Black Lives Matter, and Stand Up to Racism have demonstrated that the local is systematically and intimately always tied to the global. So our local actions are pretty much always simultaneously focused on global concerns and goals. So as my t-shirt says, think local, think global, act local. Now, in a fast-changing world in which urban agglomerations constitute the dominant habitat of the global human population, some of the most pressing challenges in the quest for environmental sustainability and to address issues of climate change and ecological degradation involve acting in cities, how we live in cities, how we live our daily lives in cities, and our attempts to reconcile and address intractable issues related to the undesirable trajectories of social, economic, and environmental change. Now, while cities are generally recognized as key sites in the persistence, production, reproduction, and indeed maintenance and diffusion of various developmental disorders within and across borders and societies in space and time, paradoxically, cities also present us invaluable strategic nodes of opportunities for inquiry and action to experiment and advance transformative propositions, which is exactly what the Transition Town movement does, we do as a movement. Right, so my studies began, my journey, should I say, began about 10 years ago when my daughter was born. And this was around 2010. And the minute I held her in my arms for the first time, I had a Socratic moment, shall we say, and I asked myself, what can you do to help make the world a better place for her and the next generation? And having asked myself that, I decided to go out and learn more about the world, find out exactly what drives the world and what the problems are, and so on and so forth. Of course, we had just been recovering from the financial crisis at that point, and governments were starting to introduce measures of austerity, meanwhile bailing out the banks, etc., etc. So what I quickly came to realize was that governments were not really going to do much for us as a global society, as a national or global society. So if we wait for the governments, it will probably be too little, too late. And then I figured to myself that if I try to act alone, it will be very little. So then I decided to look at movements and also look at communities as the most relevant sites for change. And of course, this fed into, or I discovered Rob's quite famous quotes, and which is, if we wait for governments, it will be too little, too late. If we try to act as individuals, it will be too little. But if we act as communities, it might just be enough, just in time. So then in 2012, I joined the Transition Town movement, as Rob said at the beginning, and in 2014, I began my research into Transition Town Brixton. And I chose Brixton for various reasons. First, I had heard very good things about Transition Town Brixton from my political ecology lecturer and friend Robert Beale at UCL. And second, Brixton is an inner city district in London with a vibrant multicultural population. Third, there were significant uprisings in Brixton in 1981, 1985, 1995, and perhaps most recently in 2011, following the shooting of Mark Duggan in Tottenham. So Brixton always had this interesting sort of relationship, shall we say, with the police and with the justice system. And it wasn't, of course, all of Brixton. It was a particular demographic of people. Now, part of my trigger for the study was also reading an article or reading a book by Andrew Dobson. And Andrew Dobson's thesis argued that environmental sustainability and social justice do completely different things, and any sort of coming together of the two cannot be proven empirically, and it's just a marriage of convenience. So I set out to test that hypothesis. But as I joined Transition Town Brixton, and as I was looking at things that were happening, what I soon came to realize that, hold on, all environmental movements seem to be mostly with white people, and I just couldn't understand it. So then I laid out a few questions, four questions which to investigate for my research. The first question was, obviously, why is the environmental movement so white? And if we put that differently, it's in what ways does social identity, and by extension social orientation, intersect with collective action within communities? My second question was, why does inclusion and diversity matter for the environmental movement? Because, for example, if we look at the UK, racialized minority groups form about 3% of the population. So theoretically, you don't actually need that group in order to make change. And I say theoretically because I refer to research that suggests, and Erica Chenoweth, I think, said you need 3.5% of the population sort of protesting and so on to bring about change. And there's other research that suggests that at a local level, you need 35% of the population. So if we transfer that down to Brixton, where my research was based, certainly racialized minority groups within Brixton make up almost up to 40%, within Lambeth in general anyway. So theoretically, you wouldn't need to have everybody included, but there was something about environmental movements that just I couldn't understand. So I wanted to dig deeper and find out more. The third question that I asked was, how can collective action repertoires and processes of local environmental movements better engage with racialized minority groups to help build solidarity across differences? And finally, I asked, what can the Transition Town movement learn from other movements, past and present? Now, I proposed to Rob some time ago that I will at some point like to sort of hold some discussions, with different transition groups and set out my findings and so on and so forth. Of course, I don't have enough time for that. This has been a longitudinal study, 5 years so far, well, almost 6 years, and I can't cram that into 10 minutes. So I'll just go kind of to my findings for now.
Yeah, Nick, just a couple more minutes, Nick. We're just getting a bit tight on time.
Sure. Okay. Okay. So my findings suggest that the transition movement as it is, and environmental movements generally, are not attentive enough to the durable inequalities that racialized minority groups face pretty much every day. And race as a subject for social inquiry is a very, very, very dangerous subject. And most people within environmental movements sort of are not comfortable enough to address these issues. So in Brixton, I had excellent colleagues, and I put myself front and center, to try and investigate this issue. Now, we don't have much time to go, but I will be happy to sort of share the other findings later on. What I can say is that the transition time movement is what I call a Trojan horse of revolutionary possibilities, and we operate kind of under the radar. But we also must join hands, as it were, with other movements within our localities, such as Extinction Rebellion, Black Lives Matter, and so on. I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Nick, thank you so much. Fantastic. And thank you for your beautiful T-shirt as well. And I think a Trojan horse for revolutionary possibilities should be the next T-shirt in the Transition Town Brixton range, and I will be signing up for one straight away. So thank you so much. And our last speaker today is Eva Schonveld from Scotland. Eva, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yes, so I'm going to talk about the inner and why I think it's so important to lead with an awareness of the inner in our change efforts. And I thought it'd be useful just to skim over the kind of vast area that the inner covers, because it's big. It's basically talking about our experiences, both conscious and unconscious, of our emotions. That's our feelings about ourselves, about the people we're close to, and people in our communities and in wider society, and also our spiritual experience. And it's also talking about the ways that we have of relating to those experiences. So stuff like psychology, therapy, healthy group strategies and organizational dynamics, conflict mediation and transformation, meditation, religious practices. So it's this massive, sprawling area that relates to our experience. And what makes it more complex is that people are really, really different. And we have different personal and cultural tastes. We're at different parts in our journey in relationship to our own inner worlds and what we might be ready for. And we have different levels of personal resilience. So, and we're really, really sensitive around this stuff. We pick up on and have huge reactions to very subtle nuances of how the inner is brought or spoken about or acted on by other people. And so it can feel like a bit of a powder keg. And we also have little shared language to talk about our inner experience with. We have lots of little pockets of jargon, whether those are religious or psychological, but we don't have a huge amount of shared just community language to talk about this wide range of experience. Within the transition movement and change movements more generally, the inner has been kind of often seen as a way of improving our experience of the work that we do together, to make us do it better and be less damaged by the fact that it can sometimes burn us out. It can get us into really intractable conflicts with one another. It can highlight areas where we really don't feel confident and we would like to. So we've invested in finding out about how we can use structures better in our groups, so to keeping things clear and making conflict less likely in the first place. And we've looked into the way that we develop the culture of our groups, so building and maintaining relationships with the people that we work with and dealing with difficulties as they arise. And there's also the role of emotional support in our groups. And that's only going to grow with the kind of, as our system becomes increasingly under strain from inequality and climate change, we'll witness more and more that's hard to process, and be turning more and more to inner processes like the work that we connect, or mindfulness, or counseling, support groups, ritual and ceremony, all of which help us to process the difficult stuff that we feel. And in regards to that difficult stuff, that trauma is an essential lens for understanding it, because it permeates a lot of our inner experience, and it has impacts that ripple out right the way through society and through deep into our culture. And I think that's all really important to understand. So I'll just jump in with a very, very quick outline of how I understand trauma. Because it has this hugely powerful impact on how we respond to what's happening around us. So it's basically a process that our body, mind, our biology does to deal with things that we experience as overwhelming. And that can be stuff that is happening to us now as adults. We might be attacked, and we would have a trauma reaction. We might have PTSD afterwards. Soldiers coming back from conflict frequently have those kind of symptoms, and that's trauma. But we also have, all of us have quite a lot of experience from our growing up, from our childhood. Because babies and small children find quite a lot of things overwhelming. And with those experiences, with any traumatic experience, what happens is that the experience doesn't get stored in our memory in the usual way. It kind of gets stored as a pattern in our body and in our unconscious. And then, so throughout the rest of our lives, when something reminds us of that, whatever that original traumatic experience was, it jumps into replay. So we're no longer an adult having an experience. We actually behave as though in some way we are that small child, that traumatized part of ourselves. And we respond from their point of view rather than as who we are now. And we'll all remember times when we've overreacted or shut down, things that we can't cope with, like public speaking or standing up to bullies or managing our anger or coping with rejection. All of these things relate back to our childhoods. And all of them carry this sense that we don't necessarily even realize at the time that we're not really acting as adults. And this, for me, is where it gets really interesting, because this is a human phenomenon. It's something that happens to all of us. And it goes really deep personally, but it also has cultural implications. There's a deep strand of belief in our culture that in order to be safe, we need to dominate the other, whether that's other cultures, other people, or parts of ourselves. And this is the same aspect of our culture that drove us towards colonizing other peoples. And it has a massive impact on how we relate to power. I should say that alongside this sort of innate trauma response, we also have an innate capacity to make sense of our experience and to learn and grow and develop, become more whole. And both of these can be replicated at the cultural level. And most of us have experience of that kind of sense of wholeness when we're at home in situations where we feel comfortable. We're able to feel love and empathy and altruism, creativity and imagination. But we often find that in our public face, in our professional roles, we're not so in touch with those things because we've inherited a kind of cultural traumatization. And I know that Kevin speaks about this in terms of climate scientists saying really different things when they're in the pub together than they do when they're speaking, as they're in their public role. So it's a way that we kind of keep ourselves cut off from our empathy and from what's really important. And for me, this is where it gets kind of really exciting and really scary, because the people who are making big decisions on our behalf are amongst those who are most unable to be aware of the parts of themselves that are traumatized. And many of them have been deliberately traumatized by traditional upper class upbringing designed to cut them off from their empathy so that they can dominate other people. That's part of the deal. That's what we're all living with. And for me, are all the places to take a stand on this issue of the need to be more honest about our inner lives and processes. Politics is the most potent place I can think of. So bringing this analysis of the inner together with a new approach to politics could make it worth taking a look for the transition movement. Taking responsibility back for making our collective decisions starts to make it look much more like the other kinds of things, the physical infrastructure that transition groups often turn their minds to. And we need that kind of imaginative, sleeves rolled up, can-do attitude to our emotional and political and cultural infrastructure as well. So imagine a political system where we use shared governance to think about our collective decisions on how to take care of ourselves and one another and our places. And imagine having skilled facilitators, or maybe we would all be skilled facilitators, so that when conflict came up, we were able to deal with it in the moment in really skillful ways. Or imagine if someone was so stuck in their misery and their inability to feel their own empathy that they wanted to bring in policies like those we so often see on refugees, welfare reform and climate change, that somebody might take them aside and let them talk about why it was that they couldn't feel empathy for anybody outside their own group. So I think we need to take this inner aspect really seriously and give it time and space in our own lives, looking at, you know, what our next step is in terms of healing our trauma. In our local groups, creating space where we can really be ourselves, like through check-ins or appreciation rounds or meditations. And to challenge the culture of domination wherever we find it, especially in our collective decision-making spaces. And to be bold in reimagining our ways of relating from the deepest and most personal, private parts of ourselves to the biggest, most personal, most public, high-profile parts. Because it's this mindset or paradigm out of which the power, the system, its goals, power, structure, rules, and culture arises. This bottom level of Donatella's levers for its changing system, that's where the inner resides. And if we can make an impact on and change the way we relate to our inner worlds, everything else just cascades out from that, because it's so fundamental to who we are. And all the changes that we need to see, that both Nick and Kevin have been talking about, could just fall into place. It's my optimistic take.
Eva, thank you so much. Well, we talked at the beginning about how tonight was the first course of a very rich 4-course meal, and I think this has been a delicious first helping. What we'd like to do now is to give you a little bit of time to digest. We're going to take a little bit of time for us all to have that time to digest the ideas and the insights that we've just been treated to. So in a moment, you will be put into breakout groups of I think 5 people for about 15 minutes. And our invitation is to briefly introduce yourselves and then to share the time between yourselves to do 3 things. So firstly, to introduce yourself, to share one thing that surprised you or excited you, and one question that has arisen that you would like us all to explore when we come back together again. So, well, welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a really rich and useful conversation, and that you now have a question or 2 that you would like for our panelists to reflect on. So the invitation is if you could write your question in the chat box here. And my colleague Mike will sort through the questions and merge questions as we can. And so while that's happening and while you're writing your questions, I'm just going to ask each of our guests a question, which is there something that you that was in the presentations of the others, one or both of the other speakers, that particularly kind of stood out or surprised or inspired you, just a particular observation that you might like to share on the other speakers? Maybe we could take that in the order that we went through people in. Kevin, and anything that is sort of live in your mind after hearing the other 2 presentations?
I'm mute. That's the problem going first. I won't pull out one particular thing, but what I will say, both of the presentations just reminded me that responding to climate change and actually the broader sustainable development goals is much richer when we start to understand it not as a technical response. So though I spend all my time working with numbers and bits of technology, actually the real depth of response is going to emerge much more from the sort of domains of the other two speakers than it is from the sorts of realms in which I work. But often it's seen the other way around. So there are no technocratic solutions. There are some technocratic responses that may help, but ultimately it is much more an issue of society, values, community than it is of technical substitution.
Great, thank you. Nick?
Again, this was something I was talking to Eva about during the breakout. That I think issues of trauma are quite broad intergenerationally, and does her work sort of deal with that intergenerational trauma?
Great, thank you. And Eva, lastly.
Yeah, the word that keeps coming back to me from Kevin's talk is co-opted. It was very early on, and he said that the universities have been co-opted. And I think that's so much the case when we're talking or we're wondering about why the hell, when, you know, people like Kevin are so clear about what we need to do is change, and the fact that we can change. It's the fact that the so many people have, I think, largely unwittingly just slid into going along with a system that doesn't work for any of us, actually. Even, I think, the 100%, it's not the 99%, because I don't think it works for the most powerful either, even though I think they might think it does. You know, at another level, it's not good for you to be cut off from the rest of humanity and the planet in that way.
So we have a question from Ruth from Transition Ilford, who asked, can we hear more about how we can be an inclusive movement? I'm going to hand that one maybe to Nick to start with. Nick, how would you respond to that?
Yeah, thanks, Ruth. Thanks. That's of course right at the heart of my research and what I've been looking at. How we can be more inclusive movement. I think at the local level, it's very much about the narratives, about the stories you tell. For example, within Brixton, you know, as I said, there have been 4 uprisings, you know, in a few years, and it's about how you tell the stories, how you link the issues. So, how, for example, do you link issues of police violence to climate change? Now, the way we're starting to do that in Brixton, you know, is not only to support and link with other movements that are dealing with such issues. So we're in Transition Town Brixton, we're linking with Extinction Rebellion, Stand Up to Racism, and so on and so forth. But we're also telling the story under a hostile environment. So the police violence creates a hostile environment for a particular group of people. Climate change, the end result is a hostile environment for a particular group of people. Once you try to understand that, then you can make some connections that resonate with each and every group.
Right. And Eva, do you have some thoughts on that? Because a lot of your work is involved in around that kind of area too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the thing that I've seen that works best when people are othering one another, and I'm speaking completely from a perspective of personal experience, noticing that I also have othered people, and what I mean by that is just saying there's some voice somewhere inside you that goes, oh, they're not for me, or they're not like me, or they won't want to speak to me, whatever it is, some way of the best thing is to meet them and speak to them. So, and I know that people have done it to me, and when we've met and spoken, 99% of the time things change. It's like getting to know folk, taking that step over that little social barrier, whatever it is, and having a chat. That's the thing, in my experience, that works the best.
Wonderful, thank you. Kevin, a question for you, which has disappeared. Where's it gone? Oh, yes. How do we, so a question from Duncan at Transition Town Brixton. Hey, Duncan, who says, how do we speed up the transition to generative, fair, bottom-up, commensurate with Kevin's picture of urgency? And I know there was a conference you hosted a few years ago that was about exploring the practicalities of what a society that had managed to stay below 1.5 degrees would actually look like in reality. So what's your sense on how do we speed up this transition?
I don't think we have a clear answer as to how we speed it up. And I think we have to be careful to be arrogant to think that anyone knows what that response will be. And I think it would be culturally very diverse anyway, depending on which community you're talking to. So I think actually as many people engaging in that dialogue, that discussion as is possible is a good thing. And that's why I say, to me, the multiple voices that we've heard, though recognising Nick's point that it's still quite culturally narrow in some respects, but nevertheless, the multiple voices that we've heard through civil society, through Extinction Rebellion, through Transition Town, through various youth movements, I think these voices have actually started to speed things up quite considerably. Now, I don't think we see that change occurring necessarily at the national level yet, but what we have experienced in Sweden, Norway, the UK, and some other parts of Europe, at least that's to date what I've experienced, is that at the council level, at the city level, at the local level, those civil society voices are incredibly important and influential. That's not occurring yet at the national level. But I think all I can say there is the more people that get engaged, and they will have different perspectives on what is and is not important, the better. It is an emergent outcome that we're looking for.
Thank you. And a question from Steve in Edinburgh, which is addressed to Eva, but I would love to hear everybody's reflections on this, is how can we get Boris to change the way he relates to his inner world? One many of us have puzzled on, I'm sure. Eva, any thoughts?
Oh, give him a bigger hug somewhere very far away where we can't get back into the House of Commons. I don't think we start with Boris. I really don't. I think there's two ways of changing politics, and one is to get in there and work within the system, and that's fantastic, and I think loads of people should be trying to do that. And the other way is to change it from the outside, and I'm totally with Buckminster Fuller saying to don't try to change the system, create a new system that makes the old one obsolete. And I think we have to do that with politics. I think we have the tools within deliberative democracy. There's a whole raft of amazing tools that put the power in the hands of people who don't have a vested interest, who are not co-opted, in processes that are fair and transparent and thorough. And I think we have to just grab those with both hands and start using them. There's no reason that we should be relying on people who have basically completely and utterly sold us down the river. We need to be making politics work for all of us. So we can bring Boris along with us after that, because, you know, I'm sure he's a great guy underneath it all.
Well, I'm going to ask a different question, which the rest of you may choose to refer back to that in, but which is, does these times now that we've been living through the last 6-7 months, the time of COVID, how is that? Does it make it more likely, do you think, that we're going to see the urgency and the scale of change that we need to see, or not? Will we look back to this as being a really crucial watershed moment, or will it just have slipped past and just been a minor thing in that journey? Nick?
Yeah, so COVID was supposed to be the great leveler, you know, make sure that's everyone will be affected the same and so on and so forth. And again, I don't apologize for bringing race into the issue of social justice onto the table. But what's COVID has shown is that some people are affected more than others. And what that has brought about, you know, the lockdown and so on and so forth, at least within Brixton, but I know it's happening in other communities, is that different groups are starting to work together. So we're working, you know, there's almost every person I know within TTB is Transition Town Brixton is also working with Extinction Rebellion and by extension going to Black Lives Matter issues. So again, just to reiterate what Eva said, we're not going to change things from the Boris top, we're going to change it from the bottom up. And that is what we're about.
Thank you. Kevin?
it's a choice as whether we want to let these opportunities slip by is a choice. But let's remind ourselves that this was a deep tragedy for many communities, many families around the world. But nevertheless, there were many things, many lessons that we can learn from this. I think not least is various issues around value. I mean, the obvious ones to me are that the movement of the internal combustion engine meant that we could actually hear, see, and smell nature again. And I think that many people I know who actually aren't always that necessarily interested in nature actually have commented on that. But I also think really deep down and important there, the other element of value, which I think we have to be really careful because we're losing that already, is that we recognised the value of key workers. And who were the key workers? They were the shelf stackers, they're the security guards, they're the care workers. They weren't the climate professors. They weren't the great and good in our society. They weren't the high emitters in our society. There's a real correlation between the two. And how do we celebrate them? We clap them. Whilst they're on their minimum of 0 hours contracts on minimum pay, all we do is clap for them and cheer. We did not in any way respond by saying, let's start to value them seriously. So at the moment, we are still just about in that sort of memory space where we can remember that value of being able to smell, see, and hear nature. And actually, the other value is that we valued some of the people in our society who've been the ragged-trousered philanthropists for all of our lives, and we have never recognised that, and we have briefly recognised it. But I think we're losing that opportunity, but that is a choice.
Thank you. And Eva?
Yes, I think it'll be a turning point if we make it a turning point. I think what it's shown to us is that we can decide to change society radically overnight. We did it really badly. Well, they did it really badly. Loads of people got left behind and badly hurt by that. And there's a bunch of reasons and excuses for that. But basically, we all lived through an experience of deciding to do life really, really differently. And if we don't, we mustn't let ourselves forget about that. I think we're all in a big hurry for a whole lot of different reasons to try and forget about COVID. But I think it's an amazing spurt of the imagination of our movements to say that happened. We changed overnight. We could change. Maybe we give ourselves 2 years. Maybe we plan it and manage it. How would we do that to bring ourselves down, in a sustainable way to a really low carbon lifestyle? I think it's potentially absolute dynamite, and I'm certainly intending to use it.
Something I noticed a lot of the time when I do talks, I do an imagination exercise where I invite people to go forward 10 years into a future where we had done everything you could possibly have done. And what would that be like? How would that be? And the few things that always come up with are the bird song's much louder, the air smells really clean, there are a lot less cars, there's a strong sense of collective purpose. And normally I would do that and then people would leave the theatre afterwards and go, yeah, right, like that's never going to happen. And actually, we have had a few months where that has been a tangible experience for a lot of people. There's a great question which from Trish at Sky Climate Action, which I'd like to pose to everybody, which is, how do you convey the fact that this is an emergency without panicking people and rendering them unable to do anything? Maybe Eva, we'll start that one with you.
I think probably I'm quite in favour of panicking people. I don't think enough of us have got a sense of how bad a situation we're in. But I think alongside that strong message of, this is really serious. We don't have time to mess around anymore and tinker around the edges. This is wholesale change time. Alongside that, we need to come in again with a really positive vision that this can make life better for all of us, that we can change our relationship with power, that we don't have to be living in this ridiculously stratified society where some people are seen as better for all kinds of ridiculous reasons, where we can actually kind of be our whole selves, whatever, you can take it on any level, but it's like weaving these positive visions for people and with people that I think means that that panic, then it doesn't immobilize it, it galvanizes.
Thank you. Kevin?
Sorry. I'm just going to echo what Eva's just said there. I think panicking is part of what we have to go through before we start to realize what the responses we need to put in place are. But also have to recognize that different people respond very differently to the challenges we face. So some people end up being really uplifted by initial panic, and other people feel a lot of anxiety by it. So I think we have to recognize we're not all uniform, and we have to recognize that and care for each other in that process.
Great, thank you. And Nick?
I would also like to highlight that we have not just a climate and ecological emergency, but we also have an inequality emergency. And this has been going on for a very, very long time, that we need to address, at the same time as we're dealing with the climate. Because for a lot of people, this inequality emergency is every day. It's every day. So we need to recognize that, and that only by recognizing that and trying to address that will we get others on board our mission, so to speak.
Great, thank you. And just to build on that, actually, there's a question that's come in lots of different forms from lots of different people. And one version is from Jonathan Howe, who says, what are the best techniques for reaching all of the millions of people for whom all this stuff doesn't even register on the radar, and to get them on board? I mentioned this is the biggest webinar we've ever had in the transition movement, but in the scale of things, it's still pretty tiny. How to reach way beyond that? So, do any of you have any thoughts or experiences on that? Maybe Kevin?
I think we have to recognize there is no single way. We need multiple narratives. The solutions are going to look messy. The solutions won't be just related to climate change. Climate change is just one aspect of, it's a symptom of something else that's going on with our society, which is probably more reasonably captured, but they're still too technocratic, in my view, by the sustainability goals, sustainable development goals. But there are no single simple answers to this. It is going to be a sort of eclectic, pluralistic, messy response to the challenges that we face. But I think in that, we all have this role to try and push a progressive way, that at least how we see it, a progressive way forward, and that something positive will emerge out of that. But what it will look like exactly, none of us actually know.
Great, thank you. And Nick?
Yeah, again, for many people, in the UK and around the world, climate change is not some abstract figure of parts per million, today, tomorrow, or in the distant future. Things are happening right now in their life. So I'm totally sold into the idea of working within communities. So we need to get, work within communities and try and get as many people on board within communities as possible, and in as many different communities as possible. It is really pretty much the only hope we have, I think.
Great, thank you. And Eva?
I think we need to talk to people more. I think we need to find out what the emergencies that people are facing in their lives are. And for a lot of people, that will be climate change. And for a lot of people, it will be poverty and racism and not being able to get families into healthcare. We need to have those conversations, and we need to then frame our communications and our debates and our events accordingly. So find out what's important to people. If climate change isn't important, some other aspect of this shitty system will be. And we talk about how we're going to make those changes that not only cut the causes of climate change off, but they also cut off the causes of poverty and inequality and racism and lack of access to healthcare and all the other stuff. So.
Thank you. Thank you. And there was one question that was a Kevin question, which was, is there a plan somewhere that we could take off the shelf and implement tomorrow that would get us to where we need to get to? If somebody said, Kevin, just tell us what to do, where is it? What's the best thing you would point people to, Kevin, as a sort of take this and go and get on with it?
This is going to sound like an easy get out, but I think it would have to say to recognize that we have power and agency, and that the system and the individual are not separate things. They're two sides of the same coin. And in a sense, the individual and the smaller collectors like Transition Towns or XR, whatever it might be, or even academics with integrity, a rare beast. That it's the powers that we have that are going to bring about change. So don't look to the other. What about Eva's comment? Look to ourselves and with our colleagues, our friends, our communities to drive change. I'm sorry that sounds like an easy get out. There is no simple single plan. I can point you to lots of incremental piecemeal, or not incremental, but piecemeal things we need to do. But ultimately, it's going to be much more messy than that, I think.
Thank you. There's a few suggestions going on in the chat there, like the Centre for Alternative Technologies Zero Carbon Britain report and the Three Horizons.
Yeah.
So there's a few things in there if people want to look more into that. So
they're all heuristics. That's the thing to remember. They're all learning tools. They don't tell us what to do. They tell us about what is possible.
Yeah. Thank you. So we're almost out of time. So I'm going to draw things to a close. We had so many wonderful questions, but we're nearly out of time. So the first thing is to thank our three amazing panelists, Eva Schonfeld, Kevin Anderson, and Nick Anim. Thank you all so much. And thank you to everyone for joining us. I hope you have found this as absorbing as we have. This has been by far the biggest webinar that the Transition Network has ever hosted. So I'd like to thank the team in the background, Mike, Rich, Nicola, and the rest of the Transition Network team behind who have made this possible. This webinar was recorded and we'll be posting it online over the next day or so. If you're new to transition, please check out transitionnetwork.org and download our essential guide to doing transition, and follow Transition Network on Twitter as @TransitionTowns or on Facebook as @Transition Network. And you can keep up with Transition Bounce Forward, which this is the first event in, on Facebook by just searching for the name, or on Twitter as @TTBounceForward. At the same time as tonight's session, tomorrow night we'll be presenting a webinar every evening for the next 3 days. Each one brings together transition practitioners from across England and Wales to share their experience. So please do join us tomorrow at the same time for the second webinar in this series, The Opportunity These Times Present. Our thanks from everyone at Transition Network and to you for joining us. Thank you so much. Good night.